We have panel 4, the hydrogen economy in industry perspective. I'll let Andy, moderating again, introduce the panel.
Thank you guys again for joining us. Again, we're going to be hanging out for a minute. I want these folks to sort of introduce themselves and tell us a little bit about their role in their business, the business itself. We have Margaret Ferenz. She is with Air Liquide. She'll tell you all about what she's doing. We have Abhiram Kannan. He is with a venture capital firm, right, called Bidra. Is that right? Bidra? Bidra. Got you. And then John Koss is with Sempra Infrastructure. He'll tell you about exactly sort of what his company does and what they do. John, go ahead and take us there.
Sure. Am I on?
You're good.
Okay. Sure. So Sempra Corporate, we're an affiliate of Sempra Corporate. We have about $72 billion in assets, been around about 150 years. We're the largest utility holding company in North America. We serve about 40 million customers and 10% of that market. So very large company. Most of our assets are in California, Mexico, Texas. You may recognize some of the affiliates, SDG&E, SoCal Gas, and Oncor in Texas. So that's kind of the utility company. I'm with Sempra Infrastructure. That's kind of an affiliate of that. We focus on LNG development, and we have clean power and networks. And so just LNG-wise, we have about 12 million tons per annum of LNG that's operating right now. We have another 12 million tons per annum under construction in Port Arthur, Texas.
Sure.
And then just under development, we have about another 30 million tons of LNG. So we're an infrastructure developer, and we're trying to help solve the global energy needs. And so all this conversation about kind of hydrogen and ammonia and CCS, I mean, that's kind of the future, and we want to be a part of it.
Is that Texas and Louisiana for the most part in terms of the LNG infrastructure? Or?
My focus is primarily Texas and Louisiana, but we also have LNG assets in Baja, Mexico on the West Coast. So we're like the only LNG operator that has Gulf Coast and West Coast LNG.
Abhiram, go ahead.
Thanks, Andy. Nice to be here. Hello, everyone. Hopefully I'm not putting you to sleep and you've had a chance to caffeinate. I work for a venture capital firm called Bidra Innovation Ventures. We're based out of San Francisco. The fund is a $250 million fund. We'll look at investing in hard tech, deep tech, whatever you want to call it, not software companies in energy, mining, water, and agriculture. The fund is set up by Morocco's OCP Group. How many of you know or have heard of the OCP Group? Just a quick show of hands. Fantastic, just the number I expected. OCP is the world's leader in phosphate mining. So if you enjoyed a salad today, there was phosphate fertilizer included in growing it. In order to make phosphate fertilizer, you need ammonia in the form of ammonium phosphate, typically. And in order to make ammonia, guess what you need? You need hydrogen. And over the course of time, OCP has been spending something like $2 billion a year on importing ammonia because unlike the US, particularly Texas, we're not blessed with natural gas. And so our thought process is how can we jumpstart the green ammonia, green hydrogen kind of movement with Morocco as the test bed, because what we are blessed with is lots of solar and wind. So that's a little bit about the corporate parent. I kind of fell into venture capital, made my way through engineering, material science, got a PhD, put on a lab coat for 10 plus years, and eventually decided I liked the fit of the suit a bit better.
Nice. Margaret, go ahead.
Thank you so much, Andy, and thank you to my fellow panelists. I am so excited to talk about this topic. Hydrogen is one of the things that is one of my favorite things to discuss. My whole career has been within hydrogen. And my name is Margaret Ferenz. I'm the Director of Commercial Strategy and Planning at Air Liquide, part of our hydrogen energy group. And what exactly does that mean? I'm really focused on hydrogen being utilized for mobility purposes. We're really seeing a large growth into that market, and that's the market that we're going to be in. My whole background has been with traditional steam methane reforming technology, and it's interesting for me to be in this new space where hydrogen is going. And of course, Air Liquide is a global company. We are present in over 70 different countries, 60,000 employees, and outside of hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen, we recognize that those are building blocks for life. So I'm just as excited as the rest of you to talk about this important topic today.
Perfect. Thanks, you guys. So we got 45 minutes that I'm going to have you guys ask a few questions if we have them. I wanted to first start, and we were sort of joking a little bit yesterday about, I'm curious from industry's perspective, because, the last panel we were talking about sort of the hydrogen economy and the excitement around it, from industry's perspective and putting up that capital and sort of thinking about those returns. Are we getting ahead of ourselves in terms of the excitement about hydrogen, or, can we sort of see the end game here? What do you think, Margaret?
Yep, go ahead. And what I love about hydrogen is that hydrogen's time is now. We recognize that in the next 30 years, 20% of the world's energy demand is going to be met by hydrogen. In the US alone, by 2030, $140 billion in revenue is going to be met with hydrogen, and that's going to support 700,000 jobs related to that. What's great about hydrogen is that I'm excited about it, and I hope the rest of you are too, because hydrogen's versatility as a fuel source and along with being an energy storage medium allows it as a potential to decarbonize these hard-to-abate sectors. And when we're talking about those sectors, we're talking about industry, we're talking about transportation, we're talking about things like chemicals and even energy storage itself. And Air Liquide is committed to ensuring that we are approaching this low-carbon hydrogen value chain. Globally, by 2035, we will have made an additional $10 billion in order to invest in the low-carbon hydrogen value chain.
I'm curious from your perspective, Abhiram, about, because you and I were sort of discussing, it's not necessarily sort of the blue hydrogen that we've all been talking about, and sort of, we just had a panel about the Permian Basin talking about natural gas. Like you said, Morocco isn't necessarily blessed with that. So it's really sort of the idea of electrolysis and sort of figuring out exactly how that works. What you're trying to do is figure out how to make that cheaper, or how somebody else can make it cheaper for you, right?
So maybe as a, to preface the conversation a little bit, there's a 100 million kind of ton market for hydrogen today. And it has very little to do with the uses we see in the future, whether that be in fuels or energy carriers and whatnot. Most of that goes directly towards making some sort of molecule. And so that is kind of our immediate use case for which we're aggressively investing in. Outside of the 250 million that BIDRA will look at some of these companies, there's an additional 12 billion set aside in things like project finance and debt that more mature companies can access from within OCP in order to scale their solutions. But what Andy said is absolutely right. Our constraints, in fact, create the opportunity. We have a decent amount of renewable electricity, low enough cost, decent capacity factor, good coastline, so water is not as much of a constraint. And the idea is that we'll pursue the electrolysis route because that is the first test bed where it actually makes sense with electricity price, and water supply, and no natural gas. I think depending on where you are in the world, the balance is a bit different. So if you're in locations where, for instance, you have lots of natural gas, but electricity is super expensive, then it makes sense to pursue SMR with things like carbon capture and create blue hydrogen.
Right.
But beyond that sort of 100 billion ton existing use case, there's infinite scope for what hydrogen can do, because I think the term cannot be used enough. It is, in fact, the Swiss Army knife. You can do pretty much everything with it, right? And so it's a valuable piece of the toolkit towards decarbonization.
John, tell me a little bit about, is from Sempra Infrastructure's perspective, is this, and please tell me if I'm wrong, is this vertical integration? Is it sort of the idea of, well, there's this, sort of LNG infrastructure that we have in place, we have access to this natural gas, why don't we go ahead and sort of make use of it? Is that sort of, I'm curious about the conversations that are happening.
Well, yeah, I can tell you just my job as a business developer for LNG and net zero. So kind of number one priority is we want to decarbonize our existing LNG plants.
Sure.
And so, we're already looking at responsibly sourced gas. We're already building a pipeline to bring 2 BCF of natural gas to Port Arthur for the project we're building right now. So very large scale already. We already have great relationships with natural gas suppliers. So those skills are very transferable. Yeah, in addition to that, we've already announced Hackberry CCS. It's a CO2 storage project in Louisiana that's going to support our Cameron LNG asset. We have a not publicly named project yet, but it was mentioned on the earnings call. But we have a similar project in Port Arthur to do CO2 storage nearby our Port Arthur LNG asset. So we're already kind of doing CCS. We already have natural gas. We're already working. We have 2 MOUs signed with Entergy Texas, Louisiana, and Texas to bring in kind of cleaner power to our assets. So these are things we're already doing for LNG, and so it's very natural just to progress over and do blue ammonia, blue hydrogen and blue ammonia. So that's something that we're actively looking at. In addition to that, we already have key customer relationships. So, the same countries that need LNG, that have to import their energy, Japan, Korea, Europe, those same countries are reaching out to us and looking for a cleaner energy solution in the future. And so kind of hydrogen and ammonia fit that bill as well. So we view it as a very natural transition.
In terms of the way that especially larger companies think about these things, think about tax incentive, think about subsidies, I imagine, again, those conversations are happening. We were joking with the panel earlier about it used to be a couple of people on a call talking about hydrogen. Now it's 10, 15 people on the same call. I'm curious from Air Liquide's perspective, obviously as an international, as a multinational company, the sort of conversations that are happening in that space where it's like, you know what, we need somebody who's an expert in regulatory, specifically the United States, but also who understands if we're exporting that product, what we have to do in Europe. I imagine those conversations are having.
Yes, absolutely. Even on a daily basis sometimes, right? Because what we recognize is that it's very crucial for government policies to play a role within the market growth. They're going to accelerate the commercialization and even the penetration of hydrogen, not just here within the U.S., but globally as well. So understanding those relationships, understanding how we can support and implement as well, they're going to be game changers in order to make this clean hydrogen ecosystem, but at a cost that everybody can afford as well.
From Bidra's perspective, is it less sort of about because you're trying to figure out the ammonia problem, and so it's not necessarily about that. You and I were talking yesterday about it's not really necessarily about the hydrogen. It's about the sort of product that you need from it, right?
Correct. And ammonia is the sort of the global scale problem that it doesn't get enough attention. But hydrogen is
putting ammonia on the map, y'all.
Yeah, it is. It's quite important, right? But if you look at where else the hydrogen could go beyond just ammonia, it's going to be critical if you wanted to make sustainable aviation fuels, for instance. And there's really no way to decarbonize long-haul transatlantic kind of flights. And we need a credible pathway to do that. And so requiring kind of clean hydrogen is critical for those types of efforts as well. And we're looking at those things as well.
Sure.
Simply because we know that if we have the ability to supply cheap green electrons, our job is to invest in technologies that can convert those green electrons into green molecules that then have clear offtake. In the short term, we'll be the 100% offtaker. But there'll be other groups interested as well.
And John, you were talking about the relationships with companies in different countries, sort of, exploiting and making sure that they understand this is part of the process of the thinking. Look, we're thinking about not only our LNG, but also sort of the end product of hydrogen. Ultimately, we can get you what you need. And again, I imagine those conversations are already happening.
Oh, absolutely. And even when we sell LNG, there's customers who have an eye to the future and feel like there's going to be either incentives or penalties for emissions in the future just for LNG, and carbon intensity targets. So you have to have a plan to decarbonize over time. And so we already have to do that for our LNG, but they also realize there's incentives in these countries already and targets being set to import hydrogen or ammonia. And so we have to pay attention to the carbon intensity targets of the IRA here in the U.S., but we also have to look at those countries, and their regulations are still being formed and changing almost daily. So with our partners, our other companies that we work with and ourselves, we're trying to understand the whole value chain and how we can best provide our customers what they need.
That's what I was going to ask too. Is there already the conversation again about, could you create a sort of cable package where, if you buy this LNG, we're going to throw in this hydrogen at, a rate. I don't know if, those contracts are happening yet, but I imagine again in your business development strategies, those are those that's
sure.
happening.
Well, we're happy to throw in some hydrogen with the LNG as a bonus, but
sure.
at the end of the day, if you're going to fully fund a project that costs multiple billions of dollars, you do need the customers to go ahead and sign the contract saying, I'm going to buy this product, and then we spend the $1 billion or multi-billions of dollars.
Sure.
So it's a little bit tough timing-wise. We already committed to spend $12 billion on the LNG project that's underway now. They sign the contracts for offtake, then we turn the project loose.
Right.
So it'll be the same way with hydrogen and ammonia. So it's a little bit difficult to throw a party favor in.
Sure.
It's a very expensive party favor.
Sure, it makes sense. Margaret, I was going to ask you're very optimistic about hydrogen. Is it cautious optimism? Is it, because I think I told you I heard from somebody in Houston in March at CERAWeek, they were talking about, look, this industry isn't going to be fully formed for a decade, which sounds fair, and these things take time. I'm curious about the conversations at Air Liquide about, let's not necessarily pump the brakes, but just, let's be thoughtful in the way that we're thinking about this strategy, yeah?
Sure, thank you. I'm not really sure of the context that this was shared in. However, what I can say is that energy transition, it's not going to happen overnight. I think all of us can gladly say that it's just not going to happen like that. However, as technology advances, costs are going to decrease. Market demand is going to shift upwards, which is going to create this accelerated development of hydrogen. And what's interesting is the private sector, all of us, we can lead. However, it's even more crucial that the government recognizes that they play a part in the demand for hydrogen. And that's what, again, I'm going in with bated optimism, and I think all of us should do this as well. Hydrogen is here. The time for hydrogen is now, and I'm excited to continue on this journey.
We were talking a little bit earlier about meetings as a venture capitalist, Abhiram. Having meetings with companies in Los Angeles, in California. Y'all are based in San Francisco. I imagine the technology is advancing very rapidly. But from y'all's perspective, we were talking about sort of cautious optimism. From your perspective, it's maybe not advancing as fast as you want, or you tell me. I'm putting words in your mouth.
I think the one-line summary is that it's advancing very, very quickly, but it isn't scaling quickly enough.
Gotcha.
What that means is that, if you look at I'll restrict this to green hydrogen. Every day there's new types of PEM electrolyzers coming on. There's new AEM membranes coming out. There's new solid oxide kind of designs. There's reversible designs coming out. They all work fantastically well at lab scale to produce maybe 1 gram, 2 grams, up to 1 kg maybe. But then that's when they start to encounter problems, because then it goes from being a science problem to being an engineering problem. And all of these things are typically not designed to scale in engineering. That's where they fail. And that's why it's really important for us to have lots of shots on goal.
Sure.
To ensure that the technologies that have solved the fundamental bench scale kind of issues incorporate this design for engineering concept and have an approach where it's mass scale. Is something that's doable, and that's not every company we talk to. In fact, that's the fair minority of the companies are actually in that category. And you'll see companies like Electric Hydrogen that was in the news several days ago, big $300-400 million round, because they think they have a system that can scale and can produce 100 megawatt electrolyzer, which is, if you think about it, it's mind blowing.
Right.
The biggest kind of electrolyzer stack that we're able to produce, whether you're in China or in the US, is typically been between 1 and 5 megawatts.
Right.
And these guys are talking about doing 100 megawatt system.
Yeah.
That's the kind of shot on goal that we get excited about.
John, I'm curious about the conversations in your business development meetings. Does that track in terms of, are folks selling you on necessarily the technology or incorporating what they're doing with Sempra infrastructure, or is it y'all sort of reaching out and trying to figure out, does this make sense for us to sell you the product that we have?
No, folks are mobilized and actively coming to us. Just about every company you can think of who's a major energy company is talking about this. And when I tell folks, well, why are we doing this, or is it moving fast enough? I look back to kind of the Paris Climate Agreement, that was signed 7 years ago. 195 countries signed a legally binding agreement to say, we want to keep the average global temperature, below 1.5 degrees Celsius. And, so 7 years has gone by to get us to this point where the IRA and 45Q and all these have been passed. We need more granularity, more understanding to take them forward. But that's already some progress in 7 years. But to keep to meet those targets for average temperature, we have to decrease CO emissions by 43% by like 2030. So that's in 7 years' time. We're supposed to decrease, global emissions by 43%. So if you think like all 195 of these countries are serious and they really want to hit that target, then we're really behind, and we have to move faster. So, but regulations are going to enable that. We can't do it without the regulations. And just to maybe pick on one specifically, in Hackberry, we applied for a Class 6 CO2 storage permit 2 years ago, and it still hadn't been approved yet. So, that's a couple 100,000 cars, emissions worth of a vehicle. It's about equivalent to a couple 100,000 vehicles per year, that goes by. So, if we get those permits approved and if we can take advantage of these regulations and we can decarbonize. So that's the goal.
In terms of the conversation that y'all or that the folks in the boardroom are having about, to their shareholders about, look, we need this capital to build this infrastructure to make sure that this industry is viable, and we promise this industry is going to be viable. I mean, is that the sort of, and obviously you may be sort of on the periphery of this, but I'm curious about what you're hearing in terms of the conversations that your board members have with shareholders about, trust us, this is going to happen.
Well, I have been involved. I presented to our board to tell them why we're doing this.
Yeah, sure.
We don't get a free pass. So, the infrastructure developers, we have to meet certain thresholds to deploy capital, certain returns. And so really the conversation is, we need to make our projects as competitive as possible, to make the decarbonized product as close as we can to the current product. But at the end of the day, it's going to be more expensive, because you're having to do CCS, that's new infrastructure, or you're having to turn hydrogen into ammonia, that's a new facility. And if you're going to export it, that's another facility. So it's just you're adding on all this capital, so that's adding more to the price of the product. And so at the end of the day, it can only happen with regulations, but the bones are there for the regulations here in the U.S. and in Japan and Korea and in Europe. So it's coming together. As we get more detail, we'll get more certainty and be able to put more money forward. But it's happening, and we're also educating some of those governments on, here's how much it costs for the clean product versus your existing product for power generation. And so we give them feedback on that. And Japan, for instance, they're going to do a cost for difference where they pay the difference for that. So that's all going on now, and it's happening, and I believe it's going to materialize. It takes some time, unfortunately, but it will materialize.
Margaret, is that consistent?
Yeah, I would agree that that's very consistent for what we're doing as well. We've announced that we're doing this advanced plan to lower our own emissions targets because we recognize it's great that we have all this plethora of technology, hydrogen electrolysis, in terms of creating hydrogen through electrolysis or steam methane reforming or ATR technology, and also carbon capture, but that means we also have to do it to our own operating facilities. So we do have targets to reduce our own CO2 emissions globally, not just here within the US, but every single site across the globe. And what's interesting is that they're committed to that. And it is part of what we have to do whenever we're presenting things is what's going to be the emissions, what's going to be abated, what are we doing to ensure that the projects are successful so that we are meeting our own climate goals as an organization.
Abhiram, is the sort of conversation that y'all are having in your meetings with not necessarily even just startups, but those who want to get involved in this space, is it, give me a sense of, you don't have to be explicit about it, but I'm curious about the numbers that y'all are talking about just in terms of we need to be prepared to think about this many million, this many billion, this sort of, I always think about, when you listen to earnings calls, it's like when you hear those numbers, they sound crazy, but at the same time, when you're talking about shifting an entire energy infrastructure, that's what it's going to cost. I'm curious about those conversations in those meetings.
Yeah, so because Morocco is a monarchy, effectively, OCP is 95% state-owned, which means we don't have shareholders. We have one visionary. He's the king, and he tells us, go do this.
Right.
It's a blessing and a curse.
Sure.
Because often bold proclamations are not made with conservative numbers, right? And so what OCP was tasked with is 1 million tons of green ammonia by 2027. And if you do the stoichiometry on ammonia, you can figure out how much green hydrogen there is in order to make that that green ammonia. And we know that this is not going to happen overnight. It's going to require lots of money and time, hence the $12.5 billion that has been committed. But we also know that you can't overnight get to the favorable unit economics on some of these products. And so the first 200,000 tons of green ammonia, which we are effectively required to produce by 2025, those are going to be produced without any constraint on the unit economics. We just need to demonstrate that it can be done. This is why I was so enthusiastic about working for OCP and BIDRA, because this type of forget the unit economics, just go make it happen is not the approach that you will get with the classic shareholder-driven kind of company, right?
Exactly. Yeah. No, it's sort of requirement. You wouldn't necessarily. It's like, well, do the numbers make sense if you're talking to shareholders? Yeah. In your instance, it's we need to make this happen, right?
It's all for our own use.
Yeah.
So we'll gladly pay for it.
Yeah.
I think the other implication here is that, or the other constraint is that the mindset has been accelerated because of, I hate to be, the broken record that says this, but because of the events in Ukraine and the butterfly effect on fertilizer prices and nitrogen, everybody kind of within OCP stood up and said, wait a minute, we don't need green ammonia 5 years from now, we need it today. Yeah. Because this is not sustainable. Yeah. And that's, I'm really thankful for having that opportunity, right?
So the timeline is accelerated, like we were talking
100%.
about. That cautious optimism it needs to be right now.
Yeah.
Yeah. John, Margaret, y'all are both in Houston, right? Mm-hmm. Abhiram, you're in Phoenix, but I'm curious. I'm sure you run into folks in Houston in your meetings. I'm curious about the role of Southeast Texas in hydrogen production. I went out and visited Air Liquide's spot in La Porte. Mm-hmm. It's super cool. It was raining that day, but it was fine. It actually was kind of like today. I'm curious, sort of the workforce, the sort of regulatory environment we were talking a little bit earlier about. Why does Houston make so much sense for a hydrogen facility or for sort of an expansion of ones that you already have there?
Maybe if I can touch a little bit about just the state of Texas in general.
Sure.
Texas is a global leader on hydrogen production, renewable electricity generation, especially within the Permian Basin. Yep. And then, of course, in terms of the expertise they have, as well as the infrastructure. And I can see that hydrogen infrastructure being robust in Texas is going to allow Texas to be a crucial part of the transportation and distribution of hydrogen. In fact, Texas has enough hydrogen reserves to fuel every single car in the state. Crazy to think about. Now, in regards to the Gulf Coast, because that robustness is already there presently, right? There's a whole lot of industry that's present there. Air Liquide's, of course, present there as well within the Gulf Coast. We would like to continue to leverage and expand our leadership position, utilizing our existing world's largest pipeline network system, along with the world's largest hydrogen cavern right here in the state of Texas, right in Beaumont itself. And we recognize that because that infrastructure is already existing there, it's much easier for us to continue to invest there. However, that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be looking at other areas across Texas as well. Again, I mentioned that the Permian Basin, one of the things that's very attractive to it is that outside of oil and gas, renewable electricity generation. Ways for you to make low carbon hydrogen, you need wind, you need solar. And because that's such an asset there, where can we utilize those molecules? Can those molecules be transported in other locations across Texas? And so I just see that Texas is going to continue to be a global powerhouse, not just within Gulf Coast, but really throughout the whole state of Texas.
And John, you were talking about sort of your region being Southeast Texas and Louisiana. I mean, I imagine, again, it's infrastructure, it's workforce, it's sort of all the above.
Sure, yeah, and abundant natural gas supply.
Sure.
We're fortunate that we can source gas from the Haynesville, which is responsibly sourced gas, so much lower emissions. There's already natural gas suppliers that are looking into kind of annual certification type systems to kind of, you want buy-in from government officials and society that this really is a clean process. I think the abundant availability of geology that's suitable for CO2 storage is a really big deal. Fortunately, that's abundant on the Gulf Coast too. So, we have the workforce, we have the regulatory environment, we have investors and companies that, Air Liquide's a good example, Sempra Infrastructure. So you kind of have all the ingredients you need to really dominate this industry.
Abhiram, I'm curious, is proximity to natural gas in Houston and Southeast Texas, does it lend itself to not necessarily being as interested in the kind of products that you're looking for, or is there sort of that startup culture that says, you know what, we're in the energy industry and we can make the solution for you?
Yeah, or maybe one word to answer the entire thing: talent.
Talent. Yeah.
There's a talent pool within the state of Texas that knows piping, pumps, compressors, high temperature things in a way that they live and breathe it, and it's not academic and theoretical. And without that, you simply cannot do anything in green molecules wherever you are in the world. And so while I'm not as enthused about the idea of using sort of natural gas to make blue hydrogen, etc., what I think is very, very important for OCP's ambitions as well as the rest of the electrolysis community and green ammonia community is we'll need the talent pool. And we'll need people from the state of Texas to enter into these industries. May not be as employees or founders, but definitely as consultants and contractors that help with these types of projects, because it cannot be done without it.
I'm curious too. We were talking a little bit about your demand is there. We were talking a little bit of a growth in the hydrogen economy and sort of that demand emerging. Abhiram, from your perspective, is there growth even of that existing demand that y'all are going to, or that you're thinking about having to meet sort of in the very near future?
Yeah, I think so. And I don't have the numbers off the top of my head, but I mean, it's a simple statement to say that the population of the Earth is going to increase, therefore there's going to be a need for more food. There's a chart out there that says something like 50% of the Earth's population would simply cease to exist had the Haber-Bosch process not been invented and optimized. And that trend is not going away. Yeah. And so while it might not be 30% like batteries are growing, it'll probably be on par with GDP growth, plus 1% maybe. Sure. But that's still a huge number in terms of sheer volume of hydrogen that's going to be required in order to make ammonia, in order to make fertilizer, and so on.
And Margaret, y'all are, I sort of talked about this too. Y'all are on the supply side, but there are now incentives. There's also sort of regulatory action to make sure that demand exists. I'm curious from y'all's perspective. I made the joke about sort of a field of dreams situation in the last panel. Is that it feels like from everything that you're telling me that demand feels pretty real? Yep, absolutely. Again, hydrogen's time is now. It's estimated within the next 30 years, 20% of the world's energy demand is going to be met by hydrogen. And in the U.S. alone, by 2030, $140 billion in revenue, which is going to require 700,000 jobs to support that demand by 2030. One of the things that our panelists were talking about is there's the talent pool that's going to be necessary. But I also agree that outside of just the operations, production, manufacturing individuals that are going to be necessary, we're also going to need things like research and development, marketing, communications. Yeah. It's going to take a huge skill set to meet this demand. And I'm confident there's quite a few of you here in the room that can meet these various roles that are going to be necessary. And what's interesting is that us within this private sector and public sector, we might see that the demand for hydrogen is increasing, and we recognize that. However, the Department of Energy even recognizes the demand increasing itself because they have recently issued $1 billion of funding that's available to just increase demand. So some of the regulatory things that have come out, for example, the bipartisan infrastructure law, that's $8 billion that's going to generate these hydrogen hubs. That's the supply side. And they've recognized that in order to increase demand for these hydrogen hubs, they have to do something. And so the Department of Energy went ahead and issued the $1 billion. And I think that that's kind of the market that we're in now, is that government regulations are starting to catch up with the needs that this is going to be necessary in order for the U.S. to continue to be a leader as it pertains to hydrogen. And John, it sounds like kind of something we were talking about in the last panel too, about those subsidies, those regulations, or those sort of regulatory actions almost de-risking for things like, building these facilities or building CCS onto existing facilities and making sure that investors and whomever understand we're de-risking because we have, 45Q, or we have some sort of regulatory framework through which we're going to do this.
Sure. So there are the incentives on the supply side, which are important. I mean, the 45Q and the PTCs, depending on your project, but they can reduce the price of your clean hydrogen or ammonia by like 25%. So that's a big deal. So that gets you part of the way there, but you're still more expensive than today's energy sources. So you're not all the way there.
Yeah.
I think, what's going to have to get us over the hump is if we get the infrastructure funding, that also helps. If there ended up being a penalty for carbon emissions, obviously that'll get you over the hump as well.
Sure.
I think we're at this point, you said Field of Dreams, do you build it and they come? Unfortunately, because it costs, several $1 billion to do these types of projects, you do have to have certainty around your customers are going to buy it before you pull the trigger. But you can spend a certain amount of money, getting your design ready and getting your cost estimates right. So we spend a lot of effort on that. And you'll see projects that have been announced in the Gulf Coast. There's probably 15 or 20 of them now that have already kind of gone into pre-feed or feed. And just to give you all a feel, that's, they're spending probably, between $10 and $30 million just to do the engineering designs and get a cost estimate and to talk about price with customers. So I think companies like that, like ourselves and others, they're willing to put some money down to understand it and understand the price of what it costs and to attract the customers. I think we haven't quite gotten over that hump, to bridge the gap to turn it loose. But everyone's positioning themselves, and the amount of hydrogen that's going to be required is massive. You're talking about like 4 or 5 times the global demand.
Right.
What exists today between what's going to be needed by 2050. So that is so massive that everyone's kind of positioning themselves to be ready to succeed in this market.
It sounds like, too, that was sort of my follow-up question was going to be, you're not having to have conversations with with the folks who are purchasing existing hydrogen right now, I imagine. They're not worried about, look, if we have this new demand sort of emerging, are we going to be displaced? It doesn't sound like at least we're there yet, right? Is that fair?
I'll take that question. I think you're right on track with that, of the fact that our current customers today, they would like us to continue to supply them with hydrogen. However, I think what's going to be very interesting is to see what's going to come out from government regulations. I think some of the things that I've heard before in panels is the carrot and the stick, right? The carrot being the incentives that you have in order to decarbonize, and the sticks being what's required, right? There's things called the ACF or ACT that's available in California today. Do we see that being present in more areas across the country where we might need to have the conversations with our existing customers of, okay, this has happened, what does this mean for us? However, what I think is interesting too is even customers are coming to us to ask us about, what are you doing to decarbonize, right?
Sure.
And I think when I first started my career, I would have never thought I would have been in this space today of talking about this topic with everybody, about the fact that hydrogen can be utilized to decarbonize. Again, my hydrogen in my operating plant was being sent over to a petrochemical facility. It's very interesting for me to be in this space now that all of us are committed to decarbonizing hydrogen or decarbonizing hard-to-abate sectors in order to create this clean hydrogen ecosystem that's really going to accelerate energy transition and ensure that there is a sustainable future.
Abhiram, we've been talking a lot about sort of the regulatory incentives and subsidies and things like that. Are there, from your perspective, if we have students out here who are thinking about maximizing, are there grants? Are there things like that? Is there money to be had to then sort of pitch their ideas to you in terms of, this is what we're thinking about the sort of future of electrolysis for hydrogen, and for the kids out there, how do they access it, right?
I don't want to rattle off a list of things that exist, but there's a lot of resources that would allow you to go and get something started in the lab without having to dilute your company or to take on equity funding to begin with. In fact, it is a strategy that even the most mature companies continue to use. You see this a lot now in things like the bipartisan infrastructure law, the bill law, where battery companies, because, we're digressing a little bit, but battery companies which are trying to onshore manufacturing that has been lost to China are now getting $500 million to set up a manufacturing facility. And I suspect the same thing will happen even within the hydrogen community as you have companies that can scale. But that is the challenge, right? Chicken and egg. You're not going to get these big, $500 million grants unless you have demonstrated technology through things like SBIR and phase 1, phase 2 grants. There's a lot of money out there that's non-dilutive in nature that I would behoove you to go and go and get.
John, I was going to ask you about how much of this hydrogen do we foresee we're going to be exporting, and does that change? We were talking a little bit about sort of the requirements if you're talking about a production tax credit. Does it change I guess, the process through which, again, y'all have these conversations about this is how we're going to do it, this is how we're implementing CCS. Is there, again, I'm curious about those conversations about sort of how these things are thought about in the future.
Well, only about 20% of the ammonia today is seaborne. The rest of most of the hydrogen and ammonia today is pretty close to where it's consumed, for fertilizer or petrochemical industry. So we do view in the future, this new use of it possibly being used for energy or power.
Sure.
That's a game changer, and so that's going to the same folks that need LNG are going to need ammonia.
Yeah.
And that's why you're looking at global demand going from hydrogen today is about 100 million tons per annum, and 4 or 5 times that is what we're expecting by 2050. So, and a lot of that's going to be going to these same countries that import LNG. So I think it is going to be a game changer. Fortunately, our customers do view kind of ammonia the same way as LNG. They're willing to enter into long-term contracts indexed to Henry Hub prices in the U.S. And so I think because they have the LNG mindset and LNG kind of already forged this path of how to do business, it's very easy for them to visualize it for ammonia and cleaner energy. So it's a very natural transition.
What about that infrastructure for actually getting that LNG to where it needs to go? Is it going to look similar to getting that hydrogen where it needs to go?
Some of it's similar. I mean, you're going to have, LNG liquefaction is very different than a hydrogen plant and an ammonia plant. They're totally different things. So you still have to build a separate plant for the hydrogen, separate plant for integrated plant for ammonia, and you'll still have an export terminal. CCS looks kind of similar, whether it's a hydrogen ammonia plant or whether it's LNG. You're still going to compress, dehydrate, put the CO2 in a pipeline, put it underneath the ground. So that looks kind of similar and is a synergy. Your export terminals can be kind of similar. There's some similarities there. But a lot of it's new. So unfortunately, you don't get to leverage a whole lot of existing infrastructure.
Sure.
I guess shipping, LPG carriers, ammonia carriers already exist today. That's another fortunate thing. There already is an ammonia industry, and it already is seaborne. And so there's already ships that can transport it. So that helps. We can leverage that.
I'm curious about, too, the sort of job landscape. We were talking a little bit about this. But even places like the Permian Basin, certainly Southeast Texas, there's sort of, there's the known entity, right? I know how to refine these products. I know what oil and gas looks like. I know what it sort of smells like and sounds like. Is it a different sell when you're talking about hydrogen and hiring that workforce? Is it just maybe it's a different person? You tell me.
A strong domestic hydrogen industry is going to be a positive impact for the U.S. economy, jobs market, and then creating this sustainable future and ultimately the clean energy transition. It's going to create thousands of long-term, well-paying jobs. And most of those skills, if not all of them, are already present here today. Regardless of whether you're in refining or any sort of industry, those skill sets can be transferable because all of us are in this new space now. Again, my whole career has been within hydrogen, but that doesn't mean it's not transferable to anybody else. And so what I would recommend is that if you've got skill sets, again, I named previously several of them, but production, operations, manufacturing, marketing, communications, research and development, and you're interested in that, especially engineering and construction, come join us. Those skill sets are going to be necessary because the demand is huge. And if you want to get a little bit away from the traditional oil and gas, come join us. But we recognize as well that for a period of time, because the energy transition is going to take some time, it's not going to happen overnight, those skill sets are still going to be necessary too. But they are easily transferable as long as we take the time to train individuals to get comfortable in this clean hydrogen ecosystem.
And Abhiram, you were talking about that sort of one-word talent here in Texas. Is it economic understanding? Is it, like Margaret was saying, is it communication skills? I imagine, for what you're looking for, obviously you're looking for, entrepreneurs and folks who sort of understand the technology of it, but at the same time, I imagine there's space in this space for different kinds of job opportunities?
100%. I think, if you look at the best companies, it's not the product, it is the story. And you can't get to that point without having this sort of business mindset and understanding the landscape, particularly economics, in how some of these contracts are written up in terms of offtake and long duration, long term, those types of things. And so for us, having folks that come out of the oil and gas industry particularly who have dealt with these types of contracts is We see that as a boon for the burgeoning sort of hydrogen industry. They're going to need that non-technical business savvy aspect when they have to go out and commercialize. Because at the end of the day, if you just build this in a lab, people will not buy it. You need to go out there and know how to sell the thing.
Yeah.
Right. It's really, really important.
Yeah, no, and I imagine, John, it's sort of a similar thing. If you're having, meetings and developing business, it's a story.
Well, I do want to talk about people and the skills that are required, especially because we're at UT. Just the LNG project that we're doing in Port Arthur, it's under construction now. We have about 600 people on site doing construction right now. That's just the people building it. It doesn't count everybody else who supported this thing. And over the next 2 years, it's going to ramp up to a couple thousand people just on site. So, when we talk about scaling up the hydrogen industry, it's going to be thousands of these types of projects. It's at another scale. That's just the people doing liquefaction. We're also doing a 72-mile pipeline to bring in the gas.
Yep.
We're also, Entergy Texas has to do a project to bring us more power. And so you have all these auxiliary projects that are going on, and that's just people building it. You have the external relations folks that have to engage the community and tell them what's going on. You have HR folks hiring people. You have procurement who has to help buy all this stuff. You need commercial people to negotiate all the contracts with all the different subcontractors that are doing all the work. So it's really an army of people, and we're ramping up big time right now just because LNG is growing.
Sure.
But I'm just imagining, this times like thousands to get the hydrogen industry where it needs to be. So it takes a lot of skilled people, and hopefully you're in the audience and you'll join us.
Questions? Yeah, perfect.
Questions from the audience?
Yep. Awesome.
My question for Abhiram. So you mentioned that there are so many fuel cells and electrolytes technologies and startups coming up, and you were right. When it comes to scaling up, systems engineering comes in and they fail, and the second law efficiency sometimes and stuff like that. What do you think is the biggest challenge to scale up these electrolyzers and fuel cells? What should we solve to scale these, extremely well lab scale fuel cells and electrolyzers to production?
It's a bit of a historical angle. Thank you for the question, by the way. If you look back at the history of fuel cells and electrolyzers, these things were never meant to be terrestrial. They were originally meant to be put on submarines, or they were supposed to go into space. Yeah. And at some point along the line of development, we lost the understanding that we're derivatizing all our next generation designs from this older concept. And so bipolar plates must be in the electrolyzer. They have to be made of titanium, and this just continued. I think the way to break away from that is to do clean slate designs, and you work backwards from what you think you can manufacture and test what you test in the lab what it is that you actually can manufacture. Don't design for the lab to show performance and then expect that it will scale up when you go into the manufacturing facility. Use the Musk approach. Simplify, delete as many things as you can from your design and prove that it works, and work backwards from manufacturing. I think that's the way the winners will likely do it.
Other questions?
Yeah, I have a question, I think, for Margaret. So in terms of hydrogen for transportation, how would you assess the technology readiness level of the trucks and the cars and all of that? Obviously they're, commercially available, but are there any limitations in terms of technology related to transportation that keep you up at night, or it's all good?
This is a question that I get all the time because it does challenge me every single night when I go to sleep. I think what's interesting is that when I think about the transportation market, there are three sectors of that. The light duty, so Toyota Mirai has, of course, their hydrogen fuel cells based, of course, in California. They're being able to be filled up by lots of different fueling companies. Then there's medium duty, which I think of as transits. If you can remember, or if you know, in the California region, there's quite a few different transit agencies that are having a lot of different RFPs out to go ahead and fuel their various different vehicles, and they're trying that right now. And then the last one is heavy duty, long haul trucking. And I have to tell you, it is, I would say, a challenge to ensure that the technology is ready and fleets are ready, right? This goes back into the carrots and the sticks. Right now, there is incentives that can ensure that this happens. However, it will even take sticks in order to ensure that there is that conversion. I have to say as well, when we're having these conversations with truck OEMs or manufacturers across the US, it does seem to be that the technology might be there, but it's kind of sort of this chicken and egg situation where they're waiting on the molecules, and the molecules being a price that makes sense, diesel parity, which is kind of hard to even think about at this moment, but it's something for us as a challenge. And then the infrastructure, right? How are you going to fuel your vehicle across the US when there is nothing available? Air Liquide just recently announced within this past week, we've got this partnership with Trillium Energy Solutions, which is part of the Love's family of companies. If you know them, they're the second or one of the largest retailing network systems throughout the US. That's a way to hit that part of the hydrogen value chain. And then the last one is ensuring that the truck OEMs are available with their vehicles. They've been tested, they're ramping up production. And so all these things have to be synchronized. One cannot just go without the other. They all have to converge together in order to ensure that the transition happens. And I am at this cusp right now, I feel. We're pivoting towards there. I can see the end in sight. But it's just going to take all of us to push it through. And it can't just be led by private sector. It's got to be led also by the government pushing that in order to ensure that the demand is there and that we are creating the clean hydrogen ecosystem. Yeah.
Great. Thanks so much to the panel. So for John and Margaret particularly, we talked a lot about large-scale hydrogen as an energy carrier, and we kind of mixed in liquefied hydrogen or hydrogen to ammonia as the energy carrier. I'd love to hear each of your thoughts on how that's going to flesh out as far as, if we're going to replicate the LNG value chain with ammonia or with liquefied hydrogen or a mix of both.
Well,
you can go first, yes.
Yeah, I'll take a shot at kind of the export angle here. Hydrogen is problematic if you're going to transport it overseas. You have to cool it to over negative 400 degrees Fahrenheit. Whereas ammonia, you only have to cool to about 30 degrees Fahrenheit. So that's already a big deal, just from a cost and logistics standpoint. In addition, ammonia is about twice as energy dense as hydrogen, and as compressed hydrogen. It's even worse if it's uncompressed hydrogen. But so if you're going to do it overseas, hydrogen's really not, it's going to be very costly and problematic just to do. So in our view, ammonia is a great energy carrier for hydrogen to transport overseas. And so we see that playing a role in the future.
Maybe if I can also tackle on that as well. Ammonia is a very stable molecule. This allows it to be able to be transported in great distances. That's why we're able to export it more globally instead of just it being staying here in the US. However, hydrogen, I do foresee in the future that liquefied hydrogen, the transportation and logistics is going to happen in the future. Maybe not today because we're not there in terms of technology advances, but I do see that it might be a way for us to export globally in the future as long as we're able to build liquid hydrogen transportation and logistics that makes sense. Liquid hydrogen delivery here in the US, for sure, great ways for us to do that because hydrogen boil off means that you're having losses, right? And so it's just not present today, but I do foresee it happening in the future, just the next decade or so.
Thanks.
I guess it's working. Margaret, so this is for you. It's kind of following up to the trucking question.
Okay.
And I don't know, I hesitate a little bit, but I want to hear your answer. You speak about fleets being willing to adopt as if they're somebody else, not you. But Air Liquide is a pretty big trucking company at the end of the day.
Yes.
I've seen you guys have delivered gas to my research facility. So I wonder, internally, where you are, where Air Liquide is on thinking about delivering hydrogen with trucks running on hydrogen, not diesel.
That's a great question because guess what? We also have those conversations with our Airgas colleagues. And Airgas, of course, is part of the Air Liquide company, and it is a very large logistics organization. And just like you said, they deliver probably cylinders, or they deliver liquid nitrogen or liquid oxygen over to your facility. I would say we're having those conversations with them daily. One of the issues that we see, though, is that the price of hydrogen is very high, right, across the ecosystem as it sits today. Even with the various different incentives, it's not enough to get it to where it's palpable for people, because you have to think about like a fleet owner, right? They care about the dollar per mile. That's what they care about. And we're just not there yet to be really attractive competitively for diesel. So that's why the carrots and the sticks are what's requiring us to make that transition. And our own internal fleet in California is impacted by the ACF ruling, which means we have to do something, whether it's with CNG, whether it's with hydrogen, or whether it's something else, or even electric vehicles. However, even the technology is not available. I can share that, we recently completed, Hyzon is a truck manufacturer that's available today. What they do is they take their fuel cell technology and they insert it into a Freightliner Cascadia truck. But even that, there's not enough of that ramp up volume. So even if we were able to make the commitment, there's not enough manufactured hydrogen fuel cell trucks available today to make this transition. So again, everything needs to be synchronized together. Excellent question. I would love for it to happen, but everything has to synchronize for us to make this transition. And if we don't have the trucks available and they're not reliable, and if we don't have the amount of retail infrastructure where I know I can go fuel my vehicle up, it's not going to take me 4 hours to do so, right? I mean, all that stuff has to come into lockstep for us to make this transition. We're getting there. It's just not there yet. So it's going to take Air Liquide and Airgas to push back onto the industry to ensure that this does happen. But really great question.
Well, I think we're at time. Thank our panel.
Thank you, guys.